were laughing when they walked out of that courtroom. My mother had this look on her face, not quite a smile, more like the expression of someone who already knew how the story ended. My father kept adjusting his tie. They thought I was going to fold. They didn't know me at all, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. A Tuesday in March 1997 at St. Vincent's Medical Center in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I was 6 years old. I had a fever of 103, and my parents left me there. Not left me with the nurses. Not dropped me off and went to get coffee. Left, as in checked me in, gave a fake insurance card at the front desk, sat with me for maybe 40 minutes while I drifted in and out, and then, when I fell asleep, walked out the front door and never came back. I didn't know that's what happened, not right away. I woke up and the room smelled like antiseptic and something floral, like someone had tried to cover the antiseptic smell with a plug-in air freshener and failed. My throat hurt. My head felt like it was wrapped in wet cotton. I called out for my mother, and a nurse came instead. She had red hair and freckles across her nose. Her name tag said, Dorothy. She sat on the edge of my bed and said, very carefully, that my parents had stepped out for a little while. She said it the way adults say things to children when they're not sure how much truth the child can handle. I was 6. I could handle more than they thought. I asked her when they were coming back. She said she didn't know. I asked her if I could have some water. She got me water. I drank it and stared at the ceiling tile, which had a water stain in the shape of something I couldn't identify, and I thought even then that something was wrong. Kids know. They don't have the vocabulary for it yet, but they know. 3 days passed. My fever broke on day 2. By day 3, I was sitting up, eating Jell-O, watching cartoons on the small TV mounted in the corner, and there was still no sign of my parents. Dorothy came in every shift. She started bringing me coloring books. She didn't talk about my parents anymore, and neither did I. On the 4th day, a woman from the Department of Children and Families came to speak with me. She had a clipboard and a kind face, and she asked me questions I didn't fully understand. Did I know my parents' names? Did I know where we lived? Did I have any other family? Aunts, uncles, grandparents. I told her my grandmother had died before I was born and that my parents didn't talk to their siblings. She wrote things down. That was how I entered the system. I spent the next 11 months in 2 different foster homes. The first one was fine, clean, quiet, 3 other kids, a foster mother who made good pancakes and didn't have a lot of time for any of us. The second one was less fine. I won't get into it. What matters is that I got through it. And then I met Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh was 61 years old when she became my foster mother. She was 5'2", wore her silver hair in a braid down her back, and had a house in Woodbury, Connecticut that smelled like cinnamon and old books. She had been a librarian for 32 years. She was widowed. She had no children of her own, which she told me on our first day together, sitting at her kitchen table over mugs of hot cocoa, like it was just a fact she wanted me to have. I always wanted children, she said. I just didn't get them the way I expected to. I didn't say anything. I was 7 by then, and I had already learned that silence was often safer than talking. She didn't push. She just slid the cocoa closer to me and went back to her crossword puzzle. That was Eleanor. She never pushed. The first few weeks, I kept waiting for something to go wrong. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, some rule I hadn't learned yet, some expectation I'd failed to meet, some version of the disappointment I'd gotten used to seeing on adults' faces. It never came. Eleanor was just consistent. She was there in the mornings. She was there when I got home from school. She made dinner. She asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. She came to my 2nd grade holiday concert even though I had exactly 1 line and sang it flat. 6 months after I moved in, she asked me if I'd want to stay permanently. I asked her what that meant. She explained adoption to me, that she would become my legal mother, that her last name would become my last name, that this would be my home not just for now, but for always. I remember sitting very still while she explained it. I remember the clock on her kitchen wall ticking. I remember thinking that always was a word I didn't entirely trust. But I said yes. The adoption was finalized when I was 8. I became Lily Marsh. My caseworker cried. Eleanor brought homemade lemon pound cake to the courthouse and shared it with everyone, including the judge, who looked genuinely surprised to be offered cake in his own courtroom. That was the beginning of the life I actually remember as mine. Eleanor was not a wealthy woman, not in any obvious way. She had her librarian's pension. She had the house, which she'd owned outright since her husband passed. She drove a 2001 Honda Civic that she kept impeccably clean and serviced every 6 months without fail. She shopped sales. She clipped coupons, actual paper coupons from the Sunday circular. She made her own jam. We took one vacation a year, always driving distance, usually somewhere in New England. She was careful with money in the way that people who grew up without much learn to be careful. But she was also, and I didn't understand this until much later, quietly, methodically building something. She never talked about it. Not once, in all the years we lived together. She talked about everything else. Books. Endlessly about books. The garden. The neighbors. Local history. The way the light looked in October over the hills outside Woodbury. She talked about her late husband Gerald with a kind of steady, uncomplicated love that I found beautiful even as a child. Even before I had words for why. She talked about my future. College. What I might want to do with my life, whether I'd thought about this or that. She never talked about money. I went to UConn on a combination of scholarships and loans. I became an accountant, which Eleanor found deeply funny, for reasons she never entirely explained, though she would smile to herself whenever she said it. I moved to Hartford after I passed my CPA exam. I visited her every other weekend. We called each other on Sunday evenings. She came to my apartment for Thanksgiving 3 years running and ate turkey at my IKEA table and told me she liked what I'd done with the place, which wasn't much, but she meant it. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 29. Stage 3. She called me on a Sunday evening, same as always, and told me after she'd asked about my week and listened to the whole answer. That was Eleanor. She didn't lead with the hard thing. She made sure I was okay first. I moved back to Woodbury 3 months into her treatment. I worked remotely. I drove her to chemo. I made dinners she sometimes couldn't eat and sat with her while she slept and read to her from whatever she was currently working through. The last year of her life, we got through a lot of Willa Cather and almost all of Patrick O'Brien. She liked to fall asleep to voices reading. She said it reminded her of being young. She died on a Thursday in April. She was 74. I was 31. I held her hand at the end. The hospice nurse was there, and a neighbor Eleanor had been close to for 20 years, and a younger woman from the library where Eleanor had worked. The room smelled like the lavender sachets Eleanor kept in her dresser drawers. Outside the window, the trees were just starting to bud. I went through the next 2 weeks the way you go through things like that, one task at a time, one day at a time, because the alternative is the weight of the whole thing landing on you at once, and you can't let that happen when there are things that need to be done. I handled the funeral arrangements. I called people. I wrote the obituary. I sorted through 50 years of accumulated belongings in a house I had loved since I was 7 years old. 3 weeks after Eleanor died, I met with her attorney. His name was Theodore Wren. He was 60-something, meticulous, with an office that smelled like old wood and had a framed print of a Robert Frost poem above the door. He was the kind of attorney who had probably been the same person for 40 years. He sat across from me, opened a folder, and began to explain Eleanor's estate. I want to be honest. I was not prepared for what he told me. Eleanor Marsh, the woman who clipped coupons and drove a 2001 Civic and made her own jam, had, over the course of her lifetime, accumulated an estate worth approximately $4.2 million. I stared at Theodore Wren for a long moment. He explained. The house, which she bought in the 1980s, was worth considerably more than she paid for it. Gerald, her late husband, had been a careful investor. Nothing flashy, just decades of consistent contributions to index funds and a few good real estate decisions. Eleanor had continued his approach, quietly and without fanfare, for the 20 years since his death. The pension, the investments, the property, the savings, it added up. She left all of it to me. Every cent, plus the house and everything in it, including a first edition she'd found at an estate sale that turned out to be worth more than she'd known. I sat in Theodore Wren's office for a long time after he finished talking. He brought me a glass of water. I drank it. Outside his window, the main street of Woodbury was going about its business. I thought about the 7-year-old who had eaten cinnamon-scented air in that kitchen for the first time and decided, quietly, not to trust the word always. Eleanor had spent 24 years proving that word right. I returned to Hartford. I talked to a financial advisor. I set up a meeting with my own attorney, a woman named Gwen, who specialized in estate law and had an extremely no-nonsense approach to everything that I appreciated enormously. I made plans for the house. I started thinking slowly and carefully about what came next. 6 weeks after Eleanor's death, I got a letter. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letterhead was from a firm in New Haven. The letter informed me that Mr. and Mrs. Doyle, my biological parents, names I had not seen written down in over 20 years, were contesting Eleanor Marsh's will. They were claiming, through their attorney, that Eleanor's adoption of me had been improper and that as my biological parents, they had legal standing to challenge the bequest. They were seeking the full value of the estate, $4.2 million. I read the letter twice. I set it on my kitchen counter. I made a cup of coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and watched a squirrel do something ambitious with a bird feeder across the street, and I thought about my mother's face in that courtroom memory I hadn't yet made. The expression of someone who already knew how the story ended. And then I called Gwen. She came to my apartment that evening with a yellow legal pad and listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, walk me through the timeline." So I did. I told her about St. Vincent's, 1997, the fake insurance card. I knew about this because the caseworker who had handled my file had told me, years later, that it had been part of what allowed the abandonment charge to stick. I told her about the 11 months in foster care and the documentation that came with it, the DCF records, the police report, the hospital records from the day I was admitted, and the days afterward when my parents did not return. I told her about the adoption proceedings, finalized in a Connecticut courtroom in 1999, presided over by a judge who had accepted Eleanor's pound cake. Gwen was writing fast. The adoption was fully legal, I said. Eleanor's attorney at the time was meticulous. "I nephew stood in my house," NetTweet. "I'm Robert Sold." "I know it is," Gwen said. "That's not what concerns me about their claim." She tapped her pen on the legal pad. "They're not actually claiming the adoption was invalid. What they're claiming, and their attorney knows this is a stretch, but here we are, is that Eleanor exerted undue influence over you during a period of your life when you were a vulnerable minor in her care, and that this influenced the shape of her estate planning." I looked at her. "That's their argument?" "That's their argument. She adopted me when I was 8. I'm 31. "I know. She set up her estate plan over decades. She never once discussed it with me. I didn't even know she had a financial advisor until after she died." "I know," Gwen said again. "I'm not saying it's a good argument. I'm saying it's the argument they're making and we need to answer it." I understood then what was happening. This wasn't actually about the law. There was no legitimate legal theory under which my biological parents, who had abandoned me in a hospital when I was 6 years old and made no effort to find me in the 25 years since, had any claim on the estate of the woman who had raised me. Their attorney knew this. My biological parents knew this, or should have. This was a pressure campaign. This was a bet that I would rather settle pay them something to go away than spend the time and money and emotional energy of a court fight. I told Gwen I wasn't settling. She smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The months that followed were not pleasant. I won't pretend otherwise. There is nothing pleasant about litigation, and there is an additional specific unpleasantness to being in the same room, across a conference table, from people who gave birth to you and then left you in a hospital when you were 6. My father looked older than I expected. My mother looked exactly the same. She had the same way of holding her chin slightly lifted that I remembered from childhood. That expression I used to think was confidence and later understood was performance. Their attorney tried several approaches. He argued the adoption had been rushed. It hadn't. It had taken 14 months from first placement to finalization. He argued Eleanor had a history of mental instability. She didn't, a fact her physician confirmed by affidavit. He argued that I had cultivated the relationship with Eleanor strategically as an adult to influence her estate planning, which was not only insulting, but also provably false, given that Eleanor had updated her will for the last time 4 years before her diagnosis, when I was living in Hartford and we were seeing each other every other weekend. He tried, in short, everything that someone tries when they don't have a case but have already committed to the fight. Each time, Gwen answered cleanly. The piece that ended it, the piece I think about now when I think about Eleanor, was the hospital records. Theodore Wren, who had handled Eleanor's legal affairs for 30 years, had in his files something neither of us had initially thought to look for: a copy of the original DCF report from 1997. Eleanor had requested it years ago, for reasons she'd never explained to me. Theodore assumed she'd wanted it for the adoption file. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was something else. Maybe Eleanor, quiet, patient, always 3 steps ahead, had known that someday someone might need it. The report documented everything: the admission to St. Vincent's, the fake insurance information, the repeated contact attempts to my parents' listed address and phone number which went unanswered, the official determination of abandonment, the transfer to DCF custody. Every step, clearly time-stamped, clearly sourced, signed off by the original caseworker. Gwen submitted it in discovery. After that, the calls from their attorney started coming less frequently. The hearing was in October, 3 days after what would have been Eleanor's 75th birthday. The courthouse in New Haven smelled like industrial cleaner and something that might have been old carpet. I wore the gray blazer I'd bought the previous spring and sat next to Glenn at the plaintiff's table and did not look at my biological parents more than I had to. Their attorney made his argument. He had refined it down to its least embarrassing version, which still wasn't very good. Gwen made ours. She was brisk and precise, and she walked the judge through the DCF documentation with the thoroughness of someone who does not enjoy wasted time. The judge was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression that communicated clearly that she had seen every variety of this kind of case and was not impressed by this one. She asked their attorney 3 questions. He answered 2 of them well and stumbled on the third, which was about the specific legal standard for undue influence in Connecticut, a standard that their claim didn't come close to meeting. She ruled from the bench. Motion dismissed. Estate stands as filed. I heard my mother make a sound across the room. Not words, just a sharp exhale. The sound of something deflating. My father said something quietly to their attorney. I didn't hear what. I looked at the table in front of me. The wood grain ran in long parallel lines. I traced one of them with my index finger and thought about Eleanor's kitchen table, which had had a similar grain, lighter in color, and which now sat in the house in Woodbury that was technically mine but still felt like hers. Gwen put her hand on my arm. Done, she said quietly. Outside, the October air was cold and bright and smelled like leaves and something faintly like exhaust from the street. I stood on the courthouse steps and called Theodore Wren to tell him. He made a sound of deep satisfaction and said that Eleanor would have been pleased, which made my eyes sting in a way I hadn't expected. I drove back to Woodbury. I let myself into the house. It smelled like old books and faintly like cinnamon, though whether that was real or memory I couldn't say. I sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for a long time. There is a version of this story that's about money. $4.2 million, dollars, a contested will, a legal battle, a ruling. Those are the facts, and they're not unimportant. But that's not what the story feels like from the inside. From the inside, it's about a woman who got a library card at age 7 in Woodbury, Connecticut, and spent the next 24 years learning what the word always was actually supposed to mean. It's about a 61-year-old librarian who drove a clean old Civic and made her own coupons and somehow, quietly, built something worth leaving and then left it to the right person. It's about what happens when someone decides you're worth staying for. My biological parents made their choice in a hospital in 1997. Eleanor made hers 6 months later at a kitchen table over 2 mugs of cocoa. I know which one mattered. I still have the first library card Eleanor helped me get. It's in a small wooden box on my dresser, next to a photo of the two of us from one of our Vermont trips. Her with her silver braid, me squinting into the sun. Both of us laughing at something the camera couldn't catch. The card is laminated, a little worn at the corners. My name on it, in the careful handwriting of a child who was trying very hard to do it right. Lily Marsh. That's who I am. That's who she made me. The rest of it, the lawsuit, the courtroom, the look on my mother's face when the judge ruled, that was just the end of something that had already been decided a long time ago in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon by a woman who meant what she said. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that October morning in New Haven. Not in any mystical sense, just the plain, mechanical way that choices stack up over time and eventually become outcomes. My biological parents made a choice in 1997. Eleanor made one in 1998, and everything that came after. The house in Woodbury, the attorney's office, the courtroom, all of it was just those two choices playing out to their natural ends. That's the thing about the decisions we make toward other people. They don't disappear. They accumulate. My parents assumed that walking out of St. Vincent's that Tuesday was a clean break, that they could leave and the leaving would stop there, contained to that one moment. But it wasn't contained. It lived in DCF records and police reports and hospital intake forms, and 25 years later it walked into a courtroom in New Haven and answered every question the judge asked before their attorney even opened his mouth. Eleanor never talked about any of this in those terms. She wasn't the kind of person who delivered lessons. But she showed me something, just by being consistent over 2 decades, that integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just showing up again and again in small ways that don't seem to matter much in the moment. Driving to chemo appointments, making dinners, reading aloud to someone who's falling asleep. It's doing the right thing when there's no audience and no reward and no particular reason to expect that it will ever be recognized. The intelligence part took me longer to understand. Eleanor was a librarian. She spent her entire career helping other people find information they needed. But she was also privately very smart about her own life, about money, about planning, about keeping records. Theodore Wren had 30 years of meticulous files. The DCF document that ended the lawsuit wasn't something Eleanor had been required to keep. She'd requested it herself years before and filed it. Whether she was thinking ahead or just being thorough, I genuinely don't know. But I think about that a lot. I think about the difference between reacting to your life and actually thinking it through, building something carefully, document by document, decision by decision, in a way that holds up later. And then there's the matter of staying in it when staying in it is hard. I won't romanticize what the months after Eleanor's death were like. Grief is not instructive while it's happening, it's just heavy. And then on top of the grief, a letter from a New Haven law firm and 2 people I hadn't spoken to since I was 6 years old, suddenly having opinions about what I deserved. The temptation to settle, to just make it stop, was real. I won't pretend it wasn't. But I had watched Eleanor face a cancer diagnosis on a Sunday evening phone call and lead with asking how my week was going. I had watched her lose weight and lose energy and lose ground and not once complain in a way that asked anything of me. She didn't collapse into her difficulty. She just kept going, with her crossword puzzles and her Willa Cather and her lavender sachets and her absolute refusal to treat her own life as a tragedy. I figured the least I could do was stay in it for a court case. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that Eleanor Marsh did not save me. That's not the right framing. She gave me a kitchen table and a library card and 24 years of proof that a person can mean what they say. What I did with that, who I became inside it, that part was mine. And maybe that's the only thing worth passing on from any of this. That the choices you make about how to treat people, how to keep your word, how to build something honest and careful and real, those choices don't disappear either. They stack up too, just in a different direction.